The Idries Shah Foundation presents A Perfumed Scorpion by Idries Shah. The Way to the Way. First published 1978. Published in this edition 2017. This work is copyright the estate of Idries Shah and contains the substance of lectures given by Idries Shah at universities in the United States of America under the aegis of the Institute for the Study of Human Knowledge and the Graduate Institute of International Studies, Fairleigh Dickinson University. This audiobook is narrated by David Ault. Whoever might perfume a scorpion will not thereby escape its sting. Hadrat Bahaudin Naqshband, the Shah. 1. Sufi Education. There is a succession of experiences which together constitute the educational and developmental ripening of the learner, according to the Sufis. People who think that each gain is the goal itself will freeze at any such stage and cannot learn through successive and superseding lessons. Jalaluddin Rumi put it in beautiful verse in the 13th century. Man gulam I anki da harabat, Quishra wazil na danad ba samat, Bazrabate ki babaya tak kad, Tabamaskam darasid yak ruzmad. I am the slave of whoever will not at each stage imagine that he has arrived at the end of his goal. Many a stage has to be left behind before the traveller reaches his destination. We can run through a number of contentions about education as understood by the Sufis and represented both in their literature, in their stories, and in their traditional ways of communicating materials and inducing experiences, to note both what is new and unfamiliar, and what may fall into the interstices of contemporary educational activity. Monitoring by the teacher maintains progress. Time lag between exposure to impacts and their absorption, together with the fact that people often abolish the impact of a story by fending it off with a wisecrack or a riposte, may make acceptable social behaviour, but it can make for lack of sensitivity in the event. Attention to these factors is a part of Sufi expertise and care. The need to monitor one's own reactions and to see why one is behaving in a certain way, self-observation without neurotic self-abasement, may be taken as the next important feature. Even at the very early stage of time lag, wisecrack and self-study, we can easily note how difficult it is for some people to get the measure of what they are doing, how one may not know one's own time lag characteristics, how one may wisecrack automatically, unable to control this response, how one may dive into an orgy of introspection. For this reason, the monitoring of the Sufi teacher may be said to be so necessary as to justify the institution of teachership. The attachment to externals, esteeming the container and not the content, is also a major human tendency, and a further explanation for the presence, or at least the effect, of the mentor. Barriers to learning. The barriers to learning may be noted through illustrative stories or observed in oneself. Secondly, they may be so ingrained through habit that there is a need for an operation of some kind, an exposure to an interchange for them to yield. We have already noted that barriers cannot be dealt with by mechanical structures, by repeatedly telling people not to be subjective, for instance. This merely makes the determination not to be subjective ingrained as a characteristic in itself. It does not impart the quality of being able to do what one thinks one should be doing. Indirect teaching. Indirect teaching and the accumulation of a number of impacts or teachings to make up a single whole is another feature of Sufi study. What is called in some disciplines enlightenment can be, in the Sufi process, the result of the falling into place of a large number of small impacts and perceptions, producing insights when the individual is ready for them. The fact that one may be learning bit by bit and storing up little pieces of information and experiences which are, almost insensibly, to come together at some later date, naturally does not recommend itself to people who may be offered elsewhere something which, it is claimed, will give them instant insights. Hence the grasping for catch-all categories of teaching, which always claim to be comprehensive. Sufi study, therefore, cannot hope to compete with instant illumination offering systems, just as the much vaunted nostrum called snake oil will claim much more attention from some people than something less dramatic. Yet the drop-by-drop activity of Sufism does cause a certain amount of restlessness, even among those who accept the postulates we have already mentioned. Hence, it is often found that people complain that their studies are not proceeding along the lines they believe to be indicated, as in the case of the tattooed lion story. In this tale, from Book 1 of Rumi's Mathnavi, a man went to a tattooist, asking for the design of a lion to be tattooed on his back. But when he felt the prick of the needle, he cried out in anguish, asking the artist what part of the animal he was working on. "The tail," said the other. "Leave the tail," cried the coward, "and do another part." But when another part of the lion was started, the customer found that it hurt him just as much, and he instructed the tattooist to abandon that area too. This went on until the artist threw his colours and needles on the ground and refused to do any more. So the artist had his wish to leave off the work, and the customer had his wish to be relieved of the pain. But the result was that nothing happened at all. The foregoing questions, too, are tied up in the educational event by the problem of attention. People who have a portion of attention attached to something other than the subject under study will often, it is held by Sufis, be virtually disabled from absorbing the lesson. This has naturally been distorted into the claim that people must marshal and focus every iota of attention before they can learn. This is, of course, the doctrine of 1 aspirin will shift my headache, therefore 1,000 of them will give me higher consciousness. But the nature, quality, and degree of attention is held by the Sufis to be as important as the more easily quantified input in learning situations. Traces of this doctrine of a psychological mean, a movement between two extremes of opinion, belief, or exercise, are indeed to be found here and there in Western literature, though seldom linked with any teaching situation. People will campaign against immodesty with little result other than self-abasement, which may be worse when pursued in excess. As Shakespeare says, self-love is not so vile as self-neglecting. Henry V, Act 2, Scene 4, lines 74 and 75. Overdoing things can be poisonous. Short of the 1,000 aspirins, we can find almost innumerable instances of analogies, if not intended teachings, if only we transpose, for illustration, not necessarily for equivalence, into more familiar fields. I have just noticed a report to the British Royal College of Physicians of work done by Dr. Elwyn Hughes, a University of Wales biologist. Massive doses of vitamin C are believed to ward off the common cold. Dr. Hughes took 350 people and gave them each 80 milligrams of vitamin C, which is just over 2.5 times the recognized normal daily requirement of 30 milligrams. These people contracted 18% fewer colds during the infection season than the control group on 30 milligrams. There was a further group given massive doses of over 80 milligrams a day. No doubt they got even fewer colds. Not a bit of it. Those ingesting over 80 milligrams got no fewer colds than the 80 milligram people. But they did get something else, continues Dr. Hughes, the tendency to form poisonous substances such as oxalic acid in the body. Excessive use of vitamin C, he says, could enhance the dangerous effects of some toxic substances already present in food. Those who have seen the random application of supposedly esoteric practices on would-be illuminates in just such a mechanical fashion will no doubt note the almost uncanny parallel here. Finding further ranges in jokes. When the other requirements are being observed, there is still more which have to be kept in balance. People who, for instance, are accustomed to hearing stories as something to make them laugh, to inculcate a moral or to illustrate a point of doctrine, often find that they are unable to look and listen for other ranges of meaning in a story. They are described by Sufis as not learners at all, at least at that stage and in that condition. They are seen to be people who are attuned to moralism or jokes or dogma. This is why Sufis so often seem to be asking people whether they really are Sufi students, or whether they are in fact students of someone else or something else. Sufis require attention to what they are teaching, in the spirit in which they are teaching it, no less than in the case of more conventional instructors. Similarly, people who come to consume, to be emotionally stimulated, whether by the presence of the teacher or the unfamiliarity and strangeness of the materials, are not students either, for the same reason. Negative and positive operation. It might be said that people are always trying to test the genuineness of the teacher, but I have found more fake students than fake teachers. Then there are those who, listening to what I have just enunciated, will say that we are harping on negatives and not affirming positives. They say this for the same reason as the others say unconsciously what they do, by their reactions. If you have to fill the pitcher, the saying goes, you may have to empty it first. To claim that it should be filled regardless of what is in it, even if that thing is unsuitable, is to say something about your own lack of insight, not about the teaching or procedures. Human completion or psychotherapy. Sufi education is aimed at what the Sufis regard as the fundamental incompleteness of humankind in general. This means that the basic problem must be tackled and not the symptoms. So Sufic education may be aiming, indeed is aiming, for this fundamental role, while the student, that is, the person who imagines himself to be a student, may be asking for psychotherapy, for secrets, for reassurance that his time has not been wasted, and so on. It is because the pitcher is already half full that Sufis have to clear the way to understanding of these basic contentions before real teaching, as distinct from overfilling, can take place. This is not to say that the Sufi wants people to abandon anything which they already know, but it does mean that the Sufi must expect, as any teacher would in any field, that the requisite conditions for learning obtain. If the desire to oppose it, or the desire to consume it, are too strongly marked, there is little prospect of the learning process taking place at all. Sufism learned by means of itself. Sufi study, too, is learned by means of itself, and rarely can even parts of it be approached through the individual claims of other formulations. It has its own postulates, some at least of which are not regarded as basic or even relevant in other systems. It is thus of the greatest importance that the student or observer of the Sufi phenomenon shall realize that Sufis do not teach in terms of other systems, however traditional or modern. Sufi work may vary and illuminate, say, psychology, We have yet to find that, say, psychology can produce a better way of studying or understanding Sufism and its teaching methods. Cult formation as an abnormality. Failure to observe Sufic criteria in trying to learn, very much more often than not, will result in the oversimplifications which lead to a cult, or the trivialization which leads to a vague religiosity, or in the intellectuality which leads to hair-splitting of an often comic kind. All these hypertrophies are well represented in cults and organizations, groups and writings which you can find all around you. I have already more than once publicly invited people to familiarize themselves with these materials, so that they might find out whether they can see things as we do, or whether they prefer the other, partial approaches. Hemispheric brain function. An Eastern position on left and right-hand brain function might well be that, however important these specializations may respectively be, and however useful it can be to define them, there is yet another mode of cognition, though it may be connected with the interplay of the two. On the subject of the two ways of thinking, Omar Khayyam, who died about 8.5 centuries ago, might have been writing in his poem about formalism and belief when he stresses that both ways of thinking give rise to equally fallacious assumptions. Kaume mutafakar and da mazab wadin, jama'e mutahayarand da shak wi yakin, naga manadi ba ayad zikamin, ki iye bekabaran, ra na'an ast na'in. People are thinking about creed and belief, all confused between doubt and certainty. Suddenly a call comes from the beyond. O uninformed ones, the road is neither this nor that. Transposition of concepts. You will observe, as we continue to examine examples of Sufi thought in the educational area, how literal is often deliberately transposed for figurative, and sequential for holistic. I say deliberately because this is not to be confused with the ordinary process by which the one becomes the other through misunderstanding or cultural deterioration. Among the Sufis, the transposition is carried out deliberately, though not as a matter of policy, only in response to situations where there has been, as it were, a congealing of thought. The Sufi teacher's perception of this is generally an inward one, so that the examples which we choose as illustrations are only the crudest, the ones which have aspects which appear in physical encounters and verbal interchanges. And it is worth remembering that this perception by the Sufi is regarded by him as linked with a cosmic intuition, which drives him to work in the field of human education of the Sufic kind. In this feeling he agrees with Einstein that the cosmic religious experience is the strongest and noblest driving force behind scientific research. This may be a driving force, but it is certainly not a discussable one. Speech and experience have opposite characteristics. As Hujwiri 1,000 years ago, quoting a Sufi director, said, "To ask about experience, hal, is absurd, because experience is the annihilation of speech." Awareness of motivation. For the Sufi in his area, as for the teacher in any more familiar one, a major consideration is whether the would-be learner is serious in his desire to learn, and whether he wants to work or play. He may be unaware of his own motivation. True and false teachers. People are always asking how they can distinguish the true from the false among the swarms of Eastern sages competing for their attention. One of the neatest and most enlightening interchanges on this subject I have ever heard is this one. Someone asked a Sufi, "How can I tell a true from a false teacher?" The Sufi replied, "I can tell you how to identify the false one." "Good," said the other man. "Anyone who does not pass your test will be my master." "It is not quite as easy as that," the Sufi told him, "because you only have to find a supposed teacher who will accept you, as you are, as a disciple. This will be the ignoramus or the fraud." Contemporary psychology. There has recently been a great deal of interest in relating Sufi knowledge to contemporary educational or psychological theories, and this continues. One of the advantages is that the literate public can, by this method, obtain some outside confirmation that Sufi teaching is authentic in the sense of being based on criteria which are verifiable by accepted methods of assessment. If a Sufi tale seems to show a knowledge of the lateral specialization of the brain, this concentrates some people's minds wonderfully. They feel that Sufism must be genuine, and it may further provide a framework through which some aspects of Sufism can be approached by those who need such reassurance. To the Sufi, however, the need for such activity is minimal. Consumerism in approaching knowledge. Transpose it into a more usual mode. Say, for instance, that people are doubtful of the advantages of a new commodity, but can see how it would fit in with their existing lives by reference to established commerce, customs, or preoccupations. Both they and the people representing the commodity would be pleased, but how far should either party go? Should the intending consumers only concentrate upon the aspects of the new commodity which please them, or reinforce their attitudes or ways? Should the introducers of the commodity put disproportionate effort into explaining these aspects, when the result might be to present the commodity inadequately, or occupy too much of one's time and energy? Again, we have the matter of balance in where attention is put, and by whom. It is perhaps fortunate that the situation does not really arise, since it is our experience that Sufi teaching and learning does not need a hard sell or soft sell, but attracts a sufficient number and variety of people without having to enter into this kind of activity. But the matter should in fact be aired, because there are so many people who will insist on approaching the Sufi study in the consumer way which I mention. Limitations of working with derivative material. There is a distinct value in working with the spin-off from Sufi study. Certain stories and other secondary materials are of great interest to many people in psychology and education today. The materials are felt to be of value to individual disciplines, and no doubt they are. But the degree to which these derivative materials may be used for such secondary or even tertiary purposes really has to be explained. It would be inappropriate to suggest that people in the West imagine that Sufism is a mine of diamonds surrounded by much useless clay which the Westerner has to prize away. It would be equally unworthy to suggest that the contemporary Sufi is elitist about his Sufism. The truth, however, is that the Sufi aim is to Sufis fundamental, and the tradition and methodologies are intact and fully operative. Such room as there is for experimentation and reinventing the wheel here is limited and limiting. You do not go to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for instance, for a device for frightening away evil spirits. Mismatching of ideas does not help anyone. It is unlikely that people now being addressed include any who view Sufi knowledge as containing bits and pieces which could be picked up and fed into existing frames of education or psychology to give them a boost, and so I need not say much about such a primitive attitude towards what is, after all, among the most comprehensive and long-lasting and versatile traditions of man on record. The desire to acquaint oneself with the variety and sophistication of the Sufi approach, however, by means of portions of its instructional methods, is not the same as looking for fragments to loot them for repair work to an existing, perhaps experimental, structure. Sufis always welcome interest in their work which really is objective or altruistic, which really is educational or scientific. But in order to familiarize oneself with the working of an elephant, grabbing the ears or tail will yield little enlightenment, commensurate with the energy employed, about elephants. In Sufi education, therefore, focus, balance, the weight given to different impacts, experiences, the attunement of the learner, these are paramount, and the Sufi teachership mediates these elements. How not to learn. When any part of a form of learning becomes available, it is standard procedure in the human community, almost compulsive behaviour, that people pick up pieces which appeal to them for vocational or psychological reasons, and charge off in all directions like Don Quixote bearing these pieces, which they then elaborate, simplify, and proclaim to be the whole thing, and something to be urgently transmitted to all and sundry. Sufi studies are no exception to this. If you allow yourself to think briefly about what happens in familiar bodies of knowledge, say medicine, philosophy, social or even political ideas, you will see what I mean. The pattern is undeniable. Now, in most such instances, it is customary for an individual or a body of people to attempt to stop this process, or to regularize the situation, by forming a single authoritative institution through which the genuine materials or knowledge and or practice can be regulated. The circuses. With the Sufis, the matter is not so simple. With us, the cults are more publicly visible than the authentic teaching. The gurus are more advertised than the substance of the study. The transitional, superseded literature is more available than the measured guidance. The reason for this is that Sufism is, in essence, in its more effective and truest form, too subtle, too delicate, too much based upon perception, to be expressed in the crude externals, the packages which people always at first demand of anything, and which they are consequently widely offered by superficialists. The successive transition from the fine to the crude is characteristic of one way of the human handling of things, and there is little to be done about it. You can hardly deny that some clowns and circuses are Sufis and Sufism, unless you can demonstrate in like terms something which is Sufism but which is authentic. Appreciation of Sufism is based on perception of it. Perception of it is different from a crude projection from it, appealing to logical or emotional minds. The onus is on the receiving culture to provide enough people interested on this level if the subtler reality is to find a means of harmonizing with that culture. It is almost, but not quite, a case of people getting the Sufis they deserve. One of the most valuable remarks I heard during my youthful Sufi studies was this one, which yielded more and more as I contemplated it. Teachership is function, not appearance. This visible institution of teachership exists in our dimension not because of the needs of the enlightened. It is there, to the contrary, because of the insensitivity of the ordinary person, who will not perceive what is there until this has been magnified into an external shape. Its first duty is to disappear from appearance and to appear in real action. It seems equally possible to me that the new knowledge of the brain hemisphere's operation may demand a similarly subtle institution to be devised for it, eventually. The example of Christianity. I have recently noticed an interesting example of the deterioration of human beliefs, even in an area where there has been continuous teaching of specific doctrines for close on 2,000 years. A study carried out in Britain showed that among Christians, while 70% believed that there was a personal God, only 30% believed that there was a devil. Furthermore, only a minority, an average of 44%, held that Christianity was a better religion than Buddhism. Among Catholics taking part in the same study, only 50% believed in the devil, while a full 92% believed in an everlasting punishment in hell. Again, in the same study, as a result of being asked factually verifiable questions as well, the research concludes that people believe more strongly in matters which cannot be verified than in ones which can. From the total of Christian believers questioned, only 1 in 3 believed in human evolution. Quite apart from several other matters which came up in that paper, published in 1962 and now quite famous, it surely is interesting to observe that the religion of a large number of religious people is at variance with the dogmas of religion which they profess, in spite of their having been exposed to its virtually unopposed specific teachings for many centuries, nearly 2,000 years. How successful is education? If Buddhism is better than Christianity, why remain a Christian? If there is no God, how can one be a Christian? If there is no devil who is presiding over the everlasting punishment in hell, how can hell be something which is still believed in? On what evidence or by what process are some of the Christian beliefs accepted and others discarded? People used to quote, "I think, therefore I am," but surely it is a matter of "I believe it, therefore it must be so." Cogito ergo sum of Descartes, 1596 to 1650. Huxley showed that this phrase, when analysed by Cartesian methods, really boils down only to "something called thought exists." It is a Sufi contention that truth is not discovered or maintained by the mere repetition of teachings. It can only be kept understood by the perpetual experience of it. And it is in the experience of truth that the Sufis have always reposed their trust. Sufism is therefore not "do as I say and not as I do," or even "do as I do," but "experience it and you will know." Modifications through imagination. The knowing, of course, has to be primary. Resorting to secondary renditions is all very well, but as Rumi said, you cannot reach the milk by way of the cheese. Speak to each person in accordance with his understanding. This aphorism used by Sufis bears study. The Sufi can only teach where there is a public demand, as well as an external goal. The public can perceive the goal only when ready to do so. It holds true in the teaching situation, where you can measure the understanding of the student. But such is the distortion of understanding in any general population, caused by the biases which cultures implant, and the programming and inflammation of the mind produced by so many pressures, that I feel we could modify this slogan in dealing with the general public to "Speak to everyone, they will modify it according to their imagination." It is often said that one should ignore obtuseness and never tackle it head-on, that by definition you can do nothing about it. How convenient it would be if things were really as simple as that. Experience shows that sometimes, at least, you must deal with obtuseness, otherwise it may indeed happen that obtuseness will deal with you. If someone were to ask you what people it was among whom you would find Christians who believed that Buddhism was a better religion, that there was a God but no devil, that concrete facts were less reliable than beliefs which could not be proved, and that there was no devil but there was an everlasting punishment in hell, would you be inclined to think that it was in Britain? Sufi Analysis of Education. After that gallop in strange but local country, we may return to our Sufic method of looking at education as carried out by the concentration of indicated impacts. First, I would like to summarize what Western people state education is. A recent study published in the United States tells us that Western education may be split into three major categories. 1. The indoctrination system, which is generally called the transmitting of the values and disciplines of the culture to the next generation. 2. The idealistic system, which believes that what is inside should be allowed to come out. This has been called Romanticism. 3. The interaction system, the most modern type, which stimulates the student and develops him or her by feedback, also known as progressivism. The Sufi attitude to these three modes is that indoctrination alone is undesirable, that idealism may ignore that there are things to put in as well as to bring out, that interaction depends for its success upon a knowledge of what, when, and how to feed back in order to enable the development, possession of knowledge, and enrichment to take place. The interaction, which is the closest to the Sufi attitude, demands that it be served by experiences which are themselves products of real understanding. In their education, therefore, the Sufis operate a method of working with their pupils which is, because based on the possibilities of the situation, sometimes mystifying to observers. The theoretical approach, making people do things or learn things because this incantation is held to be good in itself, is probably very far behind us, though I cannot forbear from quoting to you the results of an investigation into an aeroplane crash as a consequence of the folklore method of education. A wide-bodied jet with nearly 300 passengers on board was coming into land at Nairobi Airport, Kenya, one day, with a captain who had logged more than 18,000 flying hours. The plane was pulled out of its attempted landing when just within 70 feet above some rocks and scrub. It had been trying to fly below ground level. The captain had been with the company, one of the world's biggest, for 30 years. 13% of captains in this airline, it is stated, have failed their jumbo training courses, the highest failure rate in the world. Other world airlines have averaged only 3.5% failures. Investigations by their Airline Pilots Association have shown that the course given to pilots does not actually test the ability to fly the aircraft, but it is heartening to read that the working party wants the exam to be replaced by a company exam based on what pilots actually need to know to fly an aircraft. As a comparison, the American airline United is quoted as having only one failure to pass in 250 tests of pilots. Is modern education designed always on interaction? What are its sources and objectives? Sufi education is based on Sufi knowledge. What interests many outside people, I fancy, and always has, is not so much what Sufi knowledge can be, but how it is that Sufis have so much knowledge of things which other people are concerned about. I have already said that the Sufi answer to this is that they get this other knowledge. Recently noted in ancient Sufi classics are references to spaceflight, power in the atom, evolution, time and space theory, navigable balloons, sphericity of the earth, etc., as a byproduct of what modern researchers would doubtless categorize as holistic or comprehensive mentation. At any rate, it is to us a byproduct, however useful in our professions. So when we talk of education, we must admit that the Sufis are fundamentally preoccupied with their own kind of knowledge. They are deeply interested in what other people call education, but this is mainly because, in a world where cultural transmission of information and abilities is the preferred method, the nearer people come to the truth about ordinary things, the nearer they will be to the Sufi experience of objective fact, beyond culturally transmitted experience. Who would admit to ignorance? Sa'di, the classical Sufi poet, in his Rose Garden, makes a reference to this when he says that human ideas of knowledge are so fallacious that even if all conventional knowledge were to be removed from the world, there would not be one person who would admit to being ignorant. Saadi continues in pointing out the educational problems of value-laden teaching, with a little aside about a Muslim and a Jew. To my amusement, he says, a Jew and a Muslim were having an argument. The Muslim said, "If I lie, may I die a Jew." And the Jew, with equal vehemence, swore that if he were to break his bond, he would wish to be regarded as a Muslim, like his despised opponent. It is on such murky pools as these, deeply filled with assumptions and conditioned bias, that people heroically try to erect educational structures. They will try, too, to produce or elicit, condition or cajole, out of them the more balanced, fulfilled, socially acceptable man or woman. The Sufis are not always popular for having said that for every person there are differing circles of belief, including those which are held by the surrounding community, and those which are known by direct perception. Or for saying that education should come from knowledge, not theory. The aim. To help to provide people with the means to hold on to the norms of their society while acquiring the understanding of a deeper truth, without either disturbing their own equilibrium or that of their society, is the aim of Sufi education. As one Sufi has said, if ordinary people who admit the imperfection of their knowledge can sustain society, how much more can the Sufi manage to retain his equilibrium, faced both with the principles of the environment and the knowledge of where it fits in with an ultimate reality? Flexibility. What the Sufis would regard as preparatory education, preparing people for deeper experiences as well as enabling them to fit into the existing society, involves above all a flexibility of approach which many regard as inconsistent with ordinary life. That this is not so is amply demonstrated by at least 1,000 years of connected Sufi history in the Middle East and Central Asia, in the Near East, India and the Far East, even at times in parts of Europe. So first of all I would list, as useful to anyone, the Sufi effect of familiarizing people with concepts which they have not considered before. These are things which do not come into everyday life with the same sharp outline that the Sufis, through poetry, stories, and other teachings, give them. An obvious example is to be aware that circumstances alter cases, and that things considered to be absolute for some purposes are only relative for others. There are innumerable examples in the stories which I have published. One Western thinker has noticed this problem and this need. Familiar things happen, says Alfred North Whitehead, and mankind does not bother about them. It requires a very unusual mind to undertake the analysis of the obvious. Alfred North Whitehead, Science in the Modern World, 1926, page 6. We feel that such a mind is unusual only because human thought has got into a rut. This is one tale which has not yet been published. A camel and a mouse both happen to be opponents of what non-thinkers, mindless people, today love to call elitism. Each claimed that it should have what the other had, not something measured in accordance with a purported assessment of its requirements. So water was given to each of them when thirsty, but both died. The camel died of thirst because it was given the mouse's ration. The mouse died of drowning when it fell into the camel's portion. Assumptions and points of view. This form of study involves, too, being able to see things from more than one point of view. Again, we have published extensively on this. A third vital approach is to question and examine one's assumptions without, however, becoming compulsive about it. In parts of the East, of course, people have adopted this technique in isolation, and so deeply, that it gives rise to the sensation that nothing is worth doing at all, except, perhaps, examining assumptions. This and many other abuses are due to the employment of what are really instruments, not as instruments, but as holy writ or as magical spells. It is no different from repeating, say, the multiplication tables, and expecting this to cause some marvellous multiplying effect. Indeed, the pointing out of the instrumental function in totems and formulae is a characteristic of Sufis. Some thinkers, of course, in the West and even in the East, take this to such extremes that they regularly attract large audiences by declaiming at great length that people should not listen to teachers. The lesson is, therefore, that any instrument can become a totem, but few, if any, totems can become useful instruments, and then only when other circumstances are in alignment. Sequential and holistic thought. In terms of the lateral specialization of brain hemispheres, I think we have an interesting illustration here. The linear item, say a phrase composed of originally semantically significant words, becomes a dirge or magical mantram, which is transferred to the mainly holistic hemisphere in the form of something not by then endowed with sequential meaning. A word becomes a form. There is a clue perhaps to what should really happen in the Sufi tradition, that a word must have a sound, a form, and a meaning, and they must all be appreciated together. It is certainly true that Sufi experience appears to make things which are perceived as ideas come into the field of action, and actions to prompt ideas. This may also be one source of Sufis doing things which have a physical shape, but no verbal explanation, though they originate with an inspiration, and not in the form of words. It could even be maintained that Sufi education aims at getting both sides of the brain to work, and helping them to operate at times in concert, but not alternately. Hence, we may say that if the methods of Sufi learning were to be written down, the theory would be easier, but while theory becomes possible of understanding by this method, Sufism itself then becomes impossible to learn. Narratives. But a great deal of the Sufi teaching in action can be observed or deduced from narratives. While we can analyze many of these, it is lucky that they almost always have dimensions which mean that their entire versatility can seldom be completely rendered in banal terms, and therefore worn out. Even some statements which have a cracker-barrel philosopher's application can also be used to expose the deficiencies of the aphorism when pushed beyond a certain unregenerate point. Take such a beautiful and arresting saying as one which is current now both in the East and the West: "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." When this is repeated enough, with the customary sage nod or clever wink, most people imagine that it is worn out, it becomes a truism. But when it is submitted for further examination, you may add to this something extracted from Sufi educational and psychological experience. This is to observe that, unless it is understood how, when, and where to make that step, the assertion is devoid of the profound weight which casual and unthinking adoption so often ascribes to it. Another thought, emanating from a state of deep contemplation, can be fed back into sequential terms and has been known to produce a useful capacity for learning beyond the obvious. If only he knew less, or more, he would be wise. Of course, he would have to know it in a somewhat different way. Shifting of attention. The shifting of attention from the expected to the unexpected is a technique which has some value, and it makes use, in Sufi circles, of conventions by violating them, to point to assumptions as to how a story will end, and enable one to contemplate for a second or so peculiar possibilities. A certain human being once found what he realized was a magical ring. He put it on his finger and, with the usual formula, said, "Ring, do your work." In a twinkling of an eye, he found himself transformed back into the being which he had been before he had found a ring and wished to be human. Then there is a joke which serves to see, sometimes in a flash, how people are out of communication and not in the way they imagine themselves to be disconnected either. The Minister of Health of a certain country sent a telegram to the governor of a distant province. The message said, "Shall we send you more doctors?" The reply which came back from the yokels was, "Send us less of the accursed magic spells which are smiting us with disease, and we won't need any of your doctors." There is another humorous tale which, among other illustrations, emphasizes that people often think and act in isolation, not realizing that this may sooner or later end in trouble, both in the ordinary world and in spiritual studies. There was a countryman who had sold his watch because, he told a visitor, the trains ran on time within earshot, and he therefore did not need one. "But how do you tell the time, say, in the early hours of the night, when there are no trains?" "That's easy. I have a bugle by my bed. When I want to know the time at night, I blow it hard, as loud as I can, out of the window. Someone always shouts, 'Who's that fool making such a noise at 3:10 in the morning?'" Basis of Sufi theory and practice. Sufi knowledge is the knowledge of something beyond customary human perceptions, yet reached through the very world whose characteristics often stand in the way of such perceptions. This could well be a summary of the theory and practice of the Sufis. Seen in this way, something of a logic in one's approach may be reconstructed. I say reconstructed, of course, because from the Sufi viewpoint no argument or rationale is needed, no general theory of how and why one gets from A to B, because the Sufi knows about the A and B. The rationale exists for the benefit of those who may wish to approach the path but need a theory within which to do so. It might be noted, too, that by no means everyone demands such a theory, but the majority of people do, and the others will understand to whom one is talking in this regard. Energetic attention. Even this coherent, linear thinker for whom we are effectively working has to make a jump of energetic attention to grasp things which lie beyond the reach of his sequentially operating brain alone. His education has to take a new turn when he is ready for it. This point comes, by the way, at the stage indicated by this interchange. A would-be seeker asked a Sufi, "How long will it take me to arrive at the point of true understanding?" The Sufi answered, "As soon as you get to the stage where you do not ask how long it will take." This is not a conundrum. The Sufi, as I am sure you will realize, is merely saying, in a memorable way, that if your attention is on one thing, you will not be able to concentrate upon another. Learning, among the Sufis, requires attention to other things than how long things will take. Such ideas are not by any means unknown in the West, but they tend to be applied to the concepts of concentrated prayer alone, or of doing one's social duty, or heightening one's emotional pitch. The tradition of extra-dimensional perception being subject to specialized techniques apart from the moral and religious, however important these may be, is difficult indeed to find. Supersession exercises. Hence we see the Western convention in these words of John Donne in the 17th century. "I neglect God and his angels for the noise of a fly, for the rattling of a coach, for the whining of a door." This is a small example of the possible use of things of this world, this prison of dimensions, to get beyond these dimensions. Oddly enough, it has often been objected that it is absurd to use something in order to transcend that very thing. Yet the smallest example from ordinary life will surely show that that is what we are doing all the time. With the Sufis, however, it is more strongly stressed that this is so. For instance, if you teach someone how to count, starting with piles of stones in order to end up with the relatively abstract Arabic figures, you may be said to have employed the concrete to get to the abstract, and to have used stones as something which you are determined to supersede. If you do not do this, of course, keeping the constant awareness of the supersession factor in front of you, your learning system is in danger of becoming fossilized. You get conditioned to stones. The Sufi teacher's educational mission, too, is to work himself out of a job. This brings us to the seeming paradox and source of great curiosity, the Sufi organization and philosophy or ideology. The purpose of the Sufic learning frame, whether it be a school, a body of literature, or a set of ideas, is both to conduct one further and also to be dispensed with, so that it does not become an end in itself. The visible cults which are well known in the West are degenerations of learning systems, and are those which have failed to observe this essential theory, and hence produced a grotesque. Anonymity of the Sufi. Now we can explain why it is that Sufis hardly ever refer to themselves as such. It is so that the word should not become the substitute for the experience. Sufis throughout history have been known by so many names and styles that it even looks deliberate to outside observers. There are numerous different names for Sufi study centres, for the exercises, for the teacher and the learner. There are Sufi books which read like poetry, which speak of love or religion, which are full of stories or of theology, or even only the lives of saints. How, then, do Sufis know one another? Sufis just do. There is a link which needs no external object, not even a word, to maintain it. But how can we, the outsiders, it may be asked, know that all these people and all these artifacts, literature and so on, belong to the Sufi and no other tradition? Almost always because Sufis put in enough context, references to other Sufis, affirmations about Sufi experience, and so on. But there are many exceptions. For instance, although the major classics, which are numerous, are observable without doubt as Sufic, there are other books which only Sufis realize are Sufic in content and meaning. The classic historical example of this is when the great teacher Ibn Arabi of Spain wrote a book, The Interpreter of Desires, in the 13th century. He was bitterly criticized for pretending to write spiritual materials while really wallowing in love poetry. In a dramatic and historic inquisitorial event, Ibn Arabi himself interpreted the book, The Interpreter, line by line, to show his accusers the meanings in a religious sense which were veiled by his allegory, to their very great discomfiture. This is one of the most famous of all public Sufic teaching exercises. Since that time, informed people have been very chary of accusing Sufis of profanity or even irrationality. So the Sufi entity does not exist like the kind of agency we have for teaching other things. It cannot try to compete with the massive buildings of the law courts. It does not try to claim that its literature is invariably and literally true, irrespective of the state of the surrounding culture. Rather, the reverse. It does not deal in labels, at least not in labels which cannot be peeled off. The institution exists, but its cohesive force, the Sufi would say, is the knowledge which resides within it, which make it exist far more permanently than bricks and stones, theories and other externals. Harmonization. In order to learn from this institution, it is required that one harmonize with this concept. This harmonization signals the entry of the individual into the learning situation. The idea of teaching and learning among the Sufis is not always strictly similar to how it is understood in other systems. For example, few people would deny that if you are teaching a student or trying to reach him or her, and his attention is on something else, the real situation is that no teaching or learning is in fact taking place at that moment. The student is absent in reality, though present in physical terms. In conventional schools, everyone knows this, but the fact is usually monitored retrospectively by examinations, tests, or performance. But for the Sufi, the situation is everything. When you are not learning, you are not his pupil, and all responsibility towards you ceases for the period during which you have broken your contract. He seeks, of course, to draw this shortcoming to your attention, or to draw back your attention to the subject. And he tries to do this because he can. Because, that is, he has, in the modern phrase, feedback. He realizes that what he is teaching, which he feels he is conducting, is not finding a correct response. So here we have another peculiarity of Sufi learning. The concept that people's attention or receptivity may alternate in effectiveness is so much more than an observation, so different from a truism, that it is hard to describe it other than to use what is often thought today to be unacceptable terminology. He or she must be in spiritual contact with you in order to know how to help your perceptions, and above all your understanding, to develop. Imagination. The importance of the spiritual contact has, rightly, been emphasized on many occasions. Naturally, of course, this has led to it being imagined to be the real secret, the only way, the thing which must be persisted in to the exclusion of everything else, so that we have very numerous people and organizations in all countries trying to establish and maintain this contact. The results of such lopsided efforts, of course, are to produce a large number of emotional or even sanctimonious people who imagine that they feel all kinds of things. They can usually be detected by observing whether or not they give ordinary people, those not interested in spiritual and esoteric matters, what is sometimes called the creeps. If they seem weird, they probably are weird, not spiritual. Spiritual communication capacity is not to be grafted onto unsuitable bases. Sufi knowledge is also imparted by exposure to those who have potential already. In detail, this learning is carried out by what we have to call both physical and electronic procedures. But these are so many and so varied, and the very mention of them among excitable or impatient people causes so much emotional stimulus that they are best left to the actual, not the hypothetical, teaching situation. Traditionally, among the authentic Sufis, such studies always take place as part of advanced and carefully ordered programs, though some more visible and familiar circuses portray them as applicable to everyone all the time. Rites, beliefs, practices. From the educational and general theory point of view, it is sometimes quite absorbing for a Sufi to look at the rites, beliefs, and practices of many metaphysical systems, and to note the stage at which the procedures have become ossified. How, for instance, sequences of words or sounds which were quite evidently once instrumental became invested with a holy or almost totemistic importance. How certain beliefs and even working hypotheses became structured into what is now thought to be legend or even literal historical truth. It is quite tempting to speak of this, even to publish on it, but there is a distinct disadvantage. Many of these schools or cults are social phenomena, strongly believed in by their adherents, who have more often than not stabilized their lives and their psychological equilibrium on the literal or allegorical truth of what someone else may see as vestiges, fossils even, of a teaching school. To disturb such a situation can seldom have the kind of salutary results that some optimists might suppose. Apart from hostility, sheer depression can be caused. Quite often, too, nothing at all happens, as I remember from a small experience in Morocco. The Evil Eye. My wife and I went to Morocco when she was expecting a child. She went into a shop and looked at kaftans, and very much liked one of them. The price asked was far too high, and so we left the shop, only to be pursued down the street by the proprietor, who was now trying to give it us for nothing. I asked him why he should give it away like that. "Don't you understand?" he shouted. "What kind of people are you? A woman in that condition, when she covets something, puts the evil eye on anyone who doesn't give it to her. I don't want the evil eye." I said, "That is absolute nonsense, and you know it." "I know it is, but what can I do? You see, I believe it." He knew, and he knew that he knew, but he was helpless. I am not suggesting that the people who are wedded to such misunderstandings are entirely inaccessible. As long as the true facts about something are represented and available, there is always a chance, in fact a certainty, that some will appreciate them. But among the greatest discoveries of humanity, surely, is that it is surpassingly valuable not to mistake one thing for another. Among civilization's greatest weaknesses, I believe, is neglecting this lesson in certain areas. But I am not sure that if you can interest a murderer in mere robbery, you are really making progress in all useful directions. The Sufi effort towards the acquisition of extra-dimensional cognition, in spite of all the qualifications with which I have been compelled to hedge its approach, can be seen in the specialization of its attitudes. By this I mean that if you want to do something and you know something about it, you are often in a better position than a theoretician is to plan the approach to doing it. The desire matched by the means. In the West, great advances of all kinds have been made, and we need not list them, for they surround us, by the application of certain principles. So it is with the Sufis. The difference in approach is the main easily observable distinction. A desire for something, however intense, is basic, but must in both our attitudes be accompanied by a means for obtaining or attaining it. That is how you produce great feats of engineering or physics. But if you approach extra-dimensional knowledge of the Sufi kind as a consumer, or with too many assumptions derived from inapplicably different areas, at the best you will reinvent the wheel. That could take you centuries. So there are 3 approaches. The 3 approaches. In order to select one of them, one must know what they are. Most people do not, in my experience. First, you can try to force your way through by sheer effort. Your experience in your fields, and ours in our own, shows that this does not work for less crude ambitions. Second, you can imagine that you are learning when you are really only consuming or admiring or seeking attention. That is the behaviour of the cultist or ignoramus. Third, you can apply principles offered by those who are supposed to know something about the subject already. That is the way. Yet many of the people who want self-realization are not really prepared to adopt the methods offered. A delightful lady of my acquaintance who visited us recently said, "If I don't get higher consciousness before I die, I'm going to be so mad." So, learning how to learn is the Sufi answer, and it is observed by looking closely at Sufi ways of approaching things. 2 ways. One of these ways is represented in Sufi activity by inducing the individual's brain to balance itself so as to enable him to think as effectively about non-sequential things as about others. This is illustrated in a tale where the teacher, effectively, gives his pupil an exercise in thought, which is carried out by attending to the seemingly inexplicable words which he says. A man went to a Sufi and asked, "What are the ways to greater consciousness?" The Sufi said, "The ways of destiny and of great personal effort." "And how," asked the man, "is the way of great personal effort followed?" "That is a matter to be answered in the way of destiny." Another important aspect of being able to learn from the Sufi orientation involves the state of the learner. If he is, for example, liable to react aggressively or masochistically, these barriers will tend to make it difficult for him to progress. Here is an instance of something which I myself observed. The false student learns his falsity. When I was young, I was sitting one day at the entrance to the meeting place of dervishes where I was living. A man who looked like a wandering fakir trudged up to me and said, "I want to see your master." I went inside and told our teacher this, but his only words were, "I refuse to see him." Rather nervous at having to carry such a message, I nevertheless did it. The visiting dervish answered me, "A Sufi cannot, of course, refuse to see a real traveller on the way of truth, yet your master refuses to see me. It has taken this rebuff to teach me that I am not yet really a seeker. In apparently being cruel, he has done me the honour of giving me a lesson. In being seemingly kind, by welcoming me and flattering me, he would have helped perpetuate my ignorance and self-love. I only hope that you, in your turn, will learn as much from this great man as I have today." It does indeed take a lot of learning to differentiate within oneself between indulgent self-abasement and the humility without reward which enables one to learn. In a society where the refusal to see you is only interpretable as due to pressure of work or as a personal affront, it needs a lot of work on oneself. Yet when we say it takes a lot of learning, I cannot fail to observe that it is only a matter of where you put your effort. We have all seen people put more effort than is needed in Sufi study into willing a one-armed bandit to disgorge a jackpot of coins. Come back in 3 years. On another occasion, I learnt how one has to say and do whatever it is that will really help, not something from a book or a list of admonitions. I sat once with a sage who had received a visitor anxious to learn truth and had told him to come back after 3 years. I asked, "Why did you tell him to return in 3 years?" The Sufi said, "My boy, worse advice he could have got anywhere. Better advice he would not have taken." Examining assumptions. I developed the habit of examining my assumptions without this becoming a compulsion through one phrase which I heard in a teaching interchange when I must have been about 12 years old. This was when the Sufi said to someone, "If you have to ask that question, you are not going to be able to understand the answer." As time passed, I worked out how to formulate the questions whose answers might be useful to me. An attitude which can seem perplexing, but which trains the mind to be flexible without producing cynicism, is another familiar Sufi preoccupation. One of my teachers put it in this very memorable way to me, and I was able to use it as a framework through which to approach many things, including the very many changes in life and circumstances which befell me. The untaught and the wrongly taught. Hindsight, he said, shows how often yesterday's so-called truth may become today's absurdity. Real ability is to respect relative truth without damaging oneself by refusing to realize that it will be superseded. When you observe that today's controversies often reveal not relevance but the clash of the untaught with the wrongly taught, and when you can endure this knowledge without cynicism as a lover of humankind, greater compensations will be open to you than a sense of your own importance or satisfaction in thinking about the unreliability of others. The assessment of the relative importance or value of people and situations or components of a situation in regard to their learning function is a further Sufi specialization. In other words, things which happen in everyday life may or may not conduce towards learning about humanity and about extra-dimensional reality. One can become aware as to which of these are useful by having allegories or paradigms which recur and which are recalled to the mind and form a guide. One example is contained in this story. The Wise Man and Foolishness. Two men were fighting when a wise man came along. One of them ran off in a rage, and the other said to the newcomer, "I have been practicing placidity and calm for many years, and I am regarded as a religious man, and yet that man, who has become angry, calls me a fool. What good will that do him?" "Ah," said the wise man, "if you are a fool, perhaps by tomorrow when his temper cools, he will realize that it is vain to argue with fools. But if you are a fool, tomorrow you will almost certainly still be one, in spite of all your experiments in placidity. But he will have learnt something." It will not have escaped your notice that I have been moving from one illustration to another without necessarily linking the two, that we have alternated arguments and verbal statements with tales and imagery, that stress has been placed upon allegory and imagery within a sequential narrative which is not, however, expressed in historical, personality, or logical terms for very long. I have chosen this method of approaching this subject in order to attempt the switching of attention which is characteristic of the Sufi literary techniques of stimulus and what is technically termed scatter, to give you a glimpse, in 20th century terms, of the atmosphere and method of the classical books of the Sufis of the past. I have, of course, changed the allusions to local matters, such as those of 13th century Persia or the 10th and 11th centuries in Central Asia, and I have provided examples of subjects of present-day concern, and I have also made other changes in order to offer stimuli, and the lack of expected stimuli, analogous to dissertations of those ancient times. This process, in turn, the medieval Sufis developed out of the earlier frameworks which they adapted from the centuries before them, because it is the constant updating of the literature and approaches to specific audiences which most characterizes Sufi activity. This involves, as you will have seen, a method of dealing with materials which is not entirely uninteresting and is certainly selective of materials. But the selectivity is of a different kind from that to which we are accustomed, where perhaps the intention is artistic or didactic. The selection in this case is made to offer a kaleidoscope of impulses, some of them familiar, some of them intended to encourage interest, others to stimulate disagreement. But a major intention behind such materials is to enable the reader or hearer to observe his own reactions, as well as to merely react or to memorize. It is amusing to record that this technique, so easy to observe when one is on the lookout for it, has so confused and so often annoyed scholarly sequential, no doubt, analysts, that they have had very hard things to say about it. Chaotic literature. In the case of Jalaluddin Rumi's Mathnavi, written in the 13th century, literary and Orientalist specialists delight in describing it as chaotic, running off at tangents, being emotional rather than logical, full of information interlarded with tales and stories, and derivative because it is replete with quotations. Yet the Mathnavi, though not understood by everyone, is still regarded as one of the world's literary masterpieces, and by Sufis as a textbook of their schools. Its contemporary value has, of course, been reduced by the fact that present-day readers do not subscribe to all its postulates, and because one needs a Persian cultural background to make full use of its dimensions. Coming, as I do, from a culture saturated in the Mathnavi, even I had to be coached by my teachers in the parallels to Rumi's 13th century concepts before I could make the transition to the Central Asian mentality of my early years. Naturally, nobody less than a major poet could today produce anything as compelling as the form and content of the Mathnavi, but its Sufic scatter plan can nevertheless distinctly be observed and reproduced in a manner adequate for other cultures in continuing its educational work. Discontinuity. Perhaps the greatest heritage of Sufi thought, if we are to review both the literature and the actual Sufi school methods, is the establishment and maintenance, in writing and action, of the principles of flexibility and discontinuity, though not at the expense of adequate lucidity and the capacity for sustained thought. This seems to be nothing less than adding an extra switching mechanism to the established ones. By this I mean that we are all familiar with the process whereby our thinking is, so to speak, switched by others and by outside impacts. We call this the effect of emotion, or the driving force of logical thought, according to the kind of thought which is uppermost. We are also aware of what might be called deliberate thought, when we decide to think about something, either sequentially or holistically. From the latter concept we tend to assume that all our thought is controlled, or that if it is not, it is rightly uncontrolled. Who, for instance, would like to do a kind action as a deliberate decision? It has to be produced by some other impulse, something outside our control, for us to accept it as real. But the relative weakness of the ordinary untrained consciousness in being unable to switch itself off and on, to deepen itself, or to hold certain ideas in abeyance, is seen to be weak when we observe how individuals and numbers of people are played upon, diverted and pulled along channels chosen by others, sometimes acceptably, sometimes otherwise. Among the Sufis, this is regarded as lack of concentration or incomplete mentation. It is, I believe, only those who have not experienced this who tend instantly to imagine that directed thought, directed by oneself to a far greater degree than is usual, would be sure to sacrifice something else. This cannot be preached as a doctrine, since when rendered in mechanical terms, such as those which I have to use to get this down on paper, or into relatively coherent verbal terms, it sacrifices the element which gives this experience its sublime and liberating life. Alas, at a juncture such as this, when one can only speak to a limited extent about things which do not belong to the area of speech, one realizes why, to the fury and bafflement of others, so many Eastern thinkers have to content themselves with saying such things as that. Whoever has the skill to fashion precious jewelry also has the ability to hide it effectively from thieves. And there is an even harsher saying that a moment of truth is of little advantage to whoever needs a good half hour of it. But we can take consolation for the future in the Sufi teacher's somewhat negatively expressed piece of advice, which yet carries within it the instructions as to what one should do next in order to learn more. Do not be that person who puts a grain of rice into a pot with the expectation of drawing forth a handful of food when it is cooked. The Visitor from Space. I am quite sure that there is a very useful and quite unusually fruitful collaboration in the making between Sufi thought in its designed expression and the large number of people in the West who will accept that to them unfamiliar systems may have to be studied by unfamiliar methods. there is a discernible groundswell of opinion which does not want to be sidetracked by cults or satisfied with gimmicks. The first step forward from here is connected with the level of understanding. A colleague of mine in the Middle East emphasized the need for mutual understanding when we met recently, and contributed this very modern Sufi-type tale to submit to you, as a warning that we should not miss the opportunity of communicating, as the people in the story did. Scientists from this world had positioned a satellite to broadcast a call to any passing interplanetary being, to show that there was intelligent life on Earth. The apparatus was linked by a translation computer, which was designed to put the visitor's words or signals into English. Sure enough, before very long, a superior being on a space mission came across this device. Recognizing it, he dismounted from his ship and spoke into the apparatus. He said, "Earthlings, I am a Superman out of space." As the automatic translator began to type out this message, the scientists on Earth were hopping up and down in excitement. But the phrase, "Earthlings, I am a Superman out of space," was printed out, due to a lack of harmony between the vibrations of the two parties, as, "People of dirt, I am a virile heterosexual without an apartment." So the message was interpreted as a hoax, because it was too trendy and apparently nonsense by the serious Earthmen. And the spaceman, well, he was rather too serious-minded too. He decided that as there was no reply, the satellite must be broken, so he fed it to his space cat.